Well, if you think it's easy living up to a granddaughter like that, it ain't. All of my grandchildren are just a total delight. And the one thing nice about living to be almost 93 years old is having grandchildren and children like I've been blessed in having. I thought today I would talk a bit about some of the very interesting events that occurred in my family's history. In my opinion, our family has had some very unusual experiences, something well beyond what occurs to normal families. You all know the beginning. Incidentally, it's interesting that my father, who was a meticulous chronicler of the history of the family, knows almost or writes almost nothing about the Krieger family. You know that his father, Moritz, was disowned by his father, Solomon, because his failure to become the rabbi that his father had hoped he would be. So Moritz was disowned by his father, and there seems to be virtually no contact between the Krieger family other than my father or his father, actually Moritz, until Solomon died in 1881, which was the year my father was born. So the family history in the early stages revolves around the Altman family. When Moritz decided to go out into the world, he had self-taught himself to achieve a fairly well-rounded education for the time. He spoke a number of languages, was very well versed in politics and the arts and almost everything. He applied for the easiest job that a young Jew could find, was a tutor of Jewish children. In the larger cities, there was always a sufficient number of Jews where they could form their own Jewish school. The educational system in Austria at the time was run by the Catholic Church. So in order to provide a Jewish education, the Jewish community had to provide separate facilities. And in the smaller villages or out in the countryside, there was never enough money to do that. So the Jewish community would get together and they would hire a tutor who would come in and teach the required subjects to their children. And that's what happened to Moritz. He applied to a family in Skotschau, which is about 15 miles from Belitz, for a tutor for their children. Skotschau was a town of about 1,500 people, which included 6 Jewish families. And the leader of the Jewish community was a man named Albert Altman, who was the son of Herschel and Barbara Altman, who in turn were the children of an unknown Altman, who was a horse dealer. The interesting thing about the unknown name is when Barbara Altman, the father of Albert, was first married, she and her husband, Herschel, went to live with Herschel's father. And one night, there was quite a storm, thunder and lightning struck the chimney. They had a rather large house out in the countryside. Lightning struck the chimney and demolished it. The next morning, when the storm subsided, they went out to look at the damage and started rummaging through it to see what they might recover from the damage. They stumbled upon a leather chest of some sort, which they eventually opened and found that it contained nothing but gold coin. And this turned out to be the source of the well-being of the Altman family. Every year, Of course, they couldn't let anybody know they had found this fund, but they would go to Vienna and exchange some of the gold for regular money. They assumed, and probably this was the case, that the 30-year war was fought to a great extent in that particular area of Silesia, and chances are it was a Spanish payroll company that had been caught unawares by the Swedes or some of the enemy, and had to flee without taking care of their payroll, and that's what the Altman family found. So when my grandfather applied for a job, he was going into a very comfortable setup. The Altmans took quite a liking to Moritz and hired him as a tutor. And as part of that job, he ran a great number of social events, many of them religiously involved, but others regular socially as well. One of Moritz's students was Albert's niece, a Hannah Altman, or at that point Hannah Serog, whose mother was Babette after Edith was named, Edith Babette Krieger, and Hannah immediately fell in love with Moritz, and in due course, in 2 years, they got married. Babette Serog, Hannah's mother, has an extremely interesting story to tell. She married a Romanian, and they lived in Scotchow and were quite successful in business for about 10 years when the 1840 revolution started all through Europe. And in 1848, Julius Serog decided he was going back to Romania and fight in the revolution. So he persuaded Babette to join him in the return to Romania, and with 3 children, all girls, Hannah being about 3 years old at the time, and Carolyn, the oldest, maybe around 8 or 9, packed a wagon and went perhaps 1,000 kilometers or 1,000 miles, I don't know, but some considerable distance to Sibiu, Romania. Well, they lived there for about a year, and it was just more than Babette could handle. The food was scarce, the living conditions really primitive, so she told her husband she couldn't take this anymore, and she was going back to Scotchow. He said, fine. Meanwhile, they had a small child, a boy. He said, fine, you can go, but I'm staying here in Romania. So Babette packed up the 3 children, loaded the cart again, and set out for Scotchow. They'd gotten a few days' journey when they were commandeered by a unit of the Romanian army, and Babette was forced to do the laundry for the soldiers, for the officers, for almost a year. However, finally, she managed to escape on a night when the sentry got drunk, and she found horses in the wagon again and made her way back to Scotchow. It must have been a pretty harrowing experience. I can't imagine many people today trying to do the same thing. So Babette must have been a pretty sturdy character. When Babette returned to Scotchow, Barbara, her mother and Hannah's grandmother, asked that they set Babette up in a home near Scotchow, but Barbara asked that she be allowed to take Babette and raise her to make it easier for Babette to raise the other two. So my grandmother, Hannah, was actually raised by her grandmother, and she then became the source of many of the stories that she ultimately told my father. When my father was born in 1881, that marked the turning point of the welfare of the family. When my grandfather and grandmother were married, the Altmans set them up. My father had a general store, and for a while they did very well. But my grandfather was not a businessman; he was a teacher. So that ultimately the business fell on hard times, and though they put him up in a number of other enterprises, it really was evident he was not going to be an economic success. So coincidental with my father's birth, the family became quite poor. His life as a child was a great trial to the family. He was a totally inept young person. He was afraid of his own shadow. Although he was very tall for his age, he was terribly skinny. He totally lacked confidence. He became quite a concern to his mother. They figured that somehow the rest of the family were going to have to take care of my father because he certainly would not be able to take care of himself. The change occurred when you had to stay in school until age 14 in Austria in those days. So after 6 years of school, my father graduated and got a job in a woolen mill in Belitz. As a result of his good work, he was given a bolt of cloth at Christmas time, and which allowed him to have a suit made. This was his first suit that was not a hand-me-down. And when he had the suit made, he looked at himself in a mirror and was amazed. He looked like a totally different person and decided that he wasn't such a numbskull after all. He really was a normal person. He was going to make his way in the world and be a success, which he then set out to do. He was lucky enough to, through the Altman family, got a job in Kassau, in a large city in Hungary, in the distillery business. Actually, the Altmans were very much involved in the distillery business to begin with. A number of the family were in the distillery business. Anyway, that got him going. He succeeded very well in a number of endeavors. The only problem was that he had wanderlust. He couldn't stay at a job very long. As soon as he found something and succeeded at it, he wanted to try something else. And he had a number of different jobs until I guess there was an economic turndown in that part of Europe, and he found himself unable to get a job. He was in Vienna at the time and wound up finally spending all his money and was ready, heading back to Berlin to meet Zigga, his brother, to see if he'd get a job in Berlin. But en route, he ran into a young man in a restaurant, ran into a young man who was an architectural student who was going to go on a walking tour of the Tyrolean Alps to look at some of the old castles for use in his architectural education, and invited my father to come along with him. Well, they spent several weeks just tramping through the Tyrolean Alps and living off the Jewish communities. They would go, every village or town had a Jewish organization that took care of travelers needing help. And my father, despite all of his father's warnings that you don't accept charity, that you make your own way, suddenly found himself really living off other people's hard work. And one day he was sitting after dinner, sitting in a place, and he noticed that his shoe had a hole. His sole had a hole in his shoe. And there was an elderly Jewish man sitting alongside of him, and the Jewish man noticed the hole too, and he said, there's a tradition, or there's a saying in our religion that if you are living off charity and you have a hole in your shoe, you're going to live off charity for the rest of your life. Well, that brought some sense to my father. He immediately stopped his traveling and got a job, and in due course wound up in London. Well, London was quite an experience for my father. He very quickly was able to get a job with a family named Worley. Mr. Worley was of German descent. The whole family spoke German, which was a great help to my father because he spoke no English. And Mr. Worley had a bar, Garrick's Tavern, in Whitechapel, a borough of London, of which Mr. Worley was the mayor. The family really adopted my father, were very appreciative of his good effort in working, and even to the extent where when my father decided to go when my father came back to Europe to meet my mother, he was going to bring Mr. Worley's son back to New York with him to straighten him out because he was having some problems. So they really treated him like a son. They took him to Edward VII's coronation, where they had a seat in the reviewing stand, and that must have been probably the last great meeting of all of the royal heads of Europe. One interesting thing that happened to my father, there was he was just a handyman working in the bar, doing all the menial jobs. There was a man named Berliner Karl, who was inhabited the bar, who kind of took an interest in my father. He was reputed to be a thief, but they couldn't really pin anything on him. He kept an eye on my father whenever there were a lot of very shady characters in the bar, and any time that my father got too friendly with him, Berliner Karl would tell my father, don't do that or you'll have trouble with me. So he was kind of watched after my father to see that he didn't get into any trouble. One day, Berliner Karl came into the bar, called my father over, and he handed him a package wrapped in brown paper. He said, put this away, I'll be coming back for it. Well, my father took the package, and he lived above the bar. In his room, there was wallpaper that had come loose, and he hid the package behind the wallpaper. The next day, the police came around looking for Berliner Karl, and there was a reward posted for his apprehension. Also, there was an article in the paper about the theft of some of the crown jewels at the time. So my father got a little curious, and he decided to open up the package and look at it. Well, he immediately recognized it. This obviously was there were three pieces: one a Fabergé egg, a bracelet, and a brooch. He recognized that first they had the initials ER on the jewelry, so that was a tip-off. And also, he had, when in Vienna, he had seen the Habsburg crown jewels and recognized, obviously, was the Habsburg crown jewels. Well, just about that time, my father had met somebody who told him about working in the United States, and my father decided he wanted to come to the United States. But what was he going to do with this package? He didn't want to get in trouble with Berliner Carl, but luckily luckily a man came into the bar one day and called my father over. My father didn't know him, didn't recognize him at all, but it turned out to be Berliner Carl in disguise. So we asked for the package, and my father gave him the package, and when Berliner Carl left, he left a note under the drink he had ordered saying to my father, I would like to have given you a reward, but that would have made you an accomplice. So no reward. So luckily my father then was free to come to the United States, which he did, I think arriving in January of 1903, at which time my father would have been 22 years old. So all this happened before he was 22 years old. On the way to the United States, he roomed with a German who was on his way back to the United States, who had been a waiter in the United States. And my father asked this man what he thought my father could do to earn a living. And the man said, become a waiter. You make a lot of money as a waiter. So my father said, okay, I'll be a waiter. He applied for a job to the Union Hall and was able to get one quickly, but it was a very unsatisfactory place. And eventually he wound up after a couple of months, he thought he had experience to tackle some of the good restaurants. So he applied for a job at the Waldorf Astoria, which was the leading hotel in New York at the time. Pardon? Mr. Worley had two children, a son, Edward, and a daughter whose name I forgot. Edward was a few years younger than my father, and every afternoon my father had two or three hours off. Edward would get the newspaper and have my father read the newspaper to him, and that's how he learned English. For Astoria, when you applied for a job, you lined up, and the maitre d' or the captain would pick out his crew. Well, my father, say at this point, was about 6'1", about 220 pounds, and very good looking, and knew enough to really be very presentable. And he was hired, which my father thought was wonderful. No questions asked, no references required. In the United States, you applied for a job and they liked your looks, you got it, and that was it. Not like Europe at all. And strangely enough, he was able to pass himself off as an experienced waiter. However, as he very quickly moved from the dining room where they served breakfast to the dinner dining room, and there he noticed that the seating arrangements were very primitive, that they really didn't know how to run a restaurant. They never knew what tables were occupied, what tables were not, and getting people seated was a chore. So my father had with very limited schooling, still had a very active and inquiring mind. And he designed made a drawing of all of the tables in the dining room, numbered each one of them, and a little system where if the table was occupied, it would have a mark on it. If it wasn't occupied, you'd erase the mark. So he waited for the opportunity to show this to his immediate boss, but it just happened that Oscar, who ran all the dining rooms in the hotel, was standing around, and my father was not busy. And when the opportunity came, he said to a waiter next to him, these people really don't know how to run a restaurant, so that Oscar could hear this. So Oscar looked at him, and they left the room, and a few minutes later a page came along and told my father's boss that Oscar wanted to see my father in his office. So my father went over, and Oscar said, "Did I hear you correctly? We don't know how to run the dining room?" My father said, "Yes." And Oscar said something to the effect, "You could do better." And my father pulled out this drawing he had of the dining room and showed Oscar what his plan would be. Well, Oscar said, "This looks pretty good. I think we can use this. But you know, you're fired." He said, "There's no way your boss will allow you to go over his head and come to me directly, so there's nothing I can do to stop him from firing you. However, they're reopening the Plaza Hotel in a few days, and I'll see to it that you get a job as a captain at the Plaza." So my father got his envelope that day saying he was fired, but he had accomplished his effort. That system that my father developed was then picked up by every single restaurant or hotel, probably in the world. It was very simple. Anybody could have done this. It just needed the original germ of an idea. As a follow-up on that, 8 or 9 years later, when my father was in San Francisco, everybody knew, it became well known that it was my father who had designed this idea. The Southern Pacific Railroad came to him, they're headquartered in San Francisco, and asked him to design a system for their dining cars on the railroad. And he, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember railroad travel in North America prior to World War II, where the dining rooms were a thing of delight. But as you walked in, seated at your table, the waiter put a pad and triplicate in front of you, and you looked at the menu, and you wrote your own order, whatever you wanted, you wrote down. And one copy stayed at the table, one copy went to the kitchen, and one copy went to the cashier. And that system was then also adopted by every single railroad all over the world, or at least all over North America. The interesting thing is that my father, his education was really limited. Actually, I think whatever schooling he had was totally ineffective. He just simply didn't like school. He was afraid to go to school. So really, Heinrich, his oldest brother, really taught him everything that he ever learned from an educational standpoint. Shows you the value of education. I'm going to skip on the 1905. He decided to go back to Belitz to visit his parents. And there, through his sister Mitchie, he met my mother, and I don't know if it was love at first sight. I think my mother was very impressed with my father very quickly, but it took my grandparents, Moritz and Hannah, to talk when my father, they didn't know my father was listening. They were extolling Malcha's virtues and suggested that she would make a great wife for their son. That made him decide that he would marry my mother. So he proposed to her, not to Anton. Anton was not the leader of the family. Rosalia ran the family, so my father approached my grandmother to ask permission to marry her daughter. She said, whatever you two decide is fine, but no way can you get engaged. You're going back to the United States, all kinds of things can happen. If you get married, that's fine, but no ties. At the moment, you're both free to do what you want. And Aunt said, mostly don't tell your Anton, because he would be very unhappy, so just don't say anything at all. Anyway, my father, in due course, went back to the United States, but the jewelry fiasco prohibited him from getting the money that he had hoped to get to go back to marry my mother. And when she was told that there would be a delay, my mother said, no delay, come back now, marry me, and we'll earn the money together. So he went back to 1908, and they were married in Vienna. They moved back to New York, and my mother found it totally, she unable to live in New York. The weather was terrible, everything about it was just didn't suit her at all. So she said, you have to take me back to Vienna. I can't stand this place. I can't live here. My father said, I know where you like it. He had been to San Francisco in 1907. He said, I'll take you to San Francisco. And my mother said, where's that? He said, as far away from New York as you can get. So my mother said, okay, take me to San Francisco. So that's how the family wound up in San Francisco. When I was born, 1917, it was the final straw for my mother. She said to my father, this life has to stop. You have to get another job. You can't work nights. You have to get a job where you can live a normal lifetime. My father said, what am I going to do? I have no education. I don't know what else I can do. Well, now there are two stories of how the tea bag came into our lives. One story, the one that I think my father told me, is that he was, at that point, he was the assistant manager of the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, and a woman living in the hotel came in for lunch, and in due course handed the waiter some tea bags, tightly wrapped in some kind of cloth, and said, have them make up the tea for me in the kitchen. So the waiter came to my father, who happened to be standing there, and showed him the tea bags, and asked what he should do. My father said, take them in and have them make the tea. But meanwhile, he took one of the bags and brought it home and showed it to my mother. And my mother took one look at it and said, this would never make a good cup of tea. It's much too tightly, the tea's all cramped. It needs more room to breathe in. So she went into the bathroom, got some cheesecloth, got some tea out of the kitchen, and she was a very accomplished sewer, and she made up a tea bag the way she thought it should be. My father said, that's interesting, make up a box of them, and I'll take them in and have the restaurant try them out to see what happens. So she did that, and my father found a friend in the restaurant business who tried the tea bags out with his customers. And when my father came back a couple of weeks later to see how the tea was received, the man said, I need more tea. They love the tea bags. So we lived in a real working man's district in San Francisco. Every Central and Southern European race that you could think of lived in what was Daly City, section of San Francisco. And all of the women, of course, knew how to sew. So my mother got the supplies, the tea and the cheesecloth, and everybody had their own sewing machine, so she went around and organized all the women in the district to make the tea bags. And my father then would take them down and deliver them to the store, to the restaurants. The other story, which perhaps is the true one, I'm not sure, Edith, my sister Edith, came up with this story. When my father was working in London, one of his jobs was to make the coffee for the bar. And in those days, he said he would put the coffee in a like a paper bag, and then pour water over it, and that's how they made the coffee. When my mother insisted that my father get another job, he said, he said he couldn't think of anything. My mother said, let's sleep on it overnight. Maybe in the morning we'll have an idea. So in the morning, my mother reminded my father of making this coffee this way. She said, why couldn't you make tea that way? And so my father said, well, let's try it. My mother again made up the samples. So which of the stories are true, I don't know. Maybe neither of them. But eventually, this was the first time that making tea bags was commercially successful. And it just became, just overnight, it became a total success. He was the only one making the tea bags, and it was such a simple thing. Nobody else, he cornered the market so quickly, nobody else could get into it. Nobody else could do anything that could take his business away from him.
At that time, was there a string and was there a string?
Yeah, what do you know about the tag?
My father was he really wanted to be an artist. He would have loved to be an artist, except he could never make any money at it. But he loved to draw, and he used his art a great deal in the restaurant business. But then he came up with the idea that to attract interest from the restaurants and wholesale grocers who were his market, he designed the tag which they put on the tea bag so that each individual customer had his own special label. So if you were a hotel or a restaurant, you served your brand of tea, which was a huge selling point in so very quickly getting the market. And a big part of the tea business was the printing division, where they had a number of printing presses making these myriad number of tags for the tea.
I'm passing around the catalog, and you can see how they sort of promoted the individual tea labels.
Well, very quickly, this outgrew the home cottage industry method of manufacture, and my father opened a plant, immediately had to close that and open up a bigger one, and then another bigger one. They had all of the tea bag business in the western United States. Shortly after my father started, a company in New York opened doing the same thing. Unfortunately, you couldn't patent anything. Anything that you've got a patent on, somebody else could make some very minor variation and do virtually the same thing. So you could have patented the string, I guess, on the tag. That was, and you probably could have gotten around that too. So, but anyway, one other company in New York who had all the business east of the Mississippi River. This continued on until 1932, when a German company invented a machine to sew the tea bags automatically. My father debated whether he should buy a machine, and finally decided he wouldn't for two reasons. One, his health was not great, I think all during the 30s, mostly because of my brother and my ill-advised actions. His ulcers from a rather wild youth or early days in the United States started acting up on him. But probably the biggest reason, it meant, I forgot to tell you, all of the women who used to make the tea bags at home, came down and worked in the plant making tea bags. He would have had to fire them all, and he couldn't bring himself to do that. So he ultimately sold out. Ernest had graduated from college and went to work for my father, but was very uninterested in the tea bag business, and quite a disappointment to my father. After the success my brother had in Vancouver in the food business, he certainly gave no sign of that while he was working for my father. So my father, being disappointed in Ernest, then further solidified the idea that he should get out, and that would be it. I think that's about as far as I want to go in the history of the family. But I might talk a little bit about our family life growing up in San Francisco. It's been told how we were a single family. No, I had no aunts, uncles, cousins, you name it. Until the 1930s, when Hitler started acting up, none of my mother's or my father's family had any interest in coming to the United States. The two that did come over, Julius, who was Elsie's and Barry's grandfather, came over for 2 years, or less than 2 years, perhaps only a year, when he decided he would go back to Belitz. Ziga, who all told probably spent 10 years in the United States, he too decided to go back because he couldn't find a wife in the United States. He went back to Germany. So that we really were a family totally on our own. But my father had a very strong family feeling, and I think out of respect for his father and mother, respect for the tradition, for respect for Judaism, totally devoted, and my mother the same thing, totally devoted their lives to raising the 4 children. They had a very limited social life, probably partly due to the fact that for much of their early life, my father had to work at night, so they didn't socialize a great deal. But they did all the things that the Krieger family would have done in the early days of television. They devoted their whole life to raising 4 children the way they think that the 4 children should be raised. I remember it was a ritual. After dinner, we would go into the living room. Edith would play the piano for half an hour. Occasionally my father would play the violin. And we just did this all the time. My parents were both great music lovers. Immediately got season tickets for the opera, for the symphony, and instilled a great sense of music in all of us. All of our Judaism was almost totally projected towards doing the things that honored their parents. And I think instilled the same feeling in us that we respected the traditions of our parents. I often thought that my parents were of a totally different world than I was, particularly when I was an early teenager. But we always felt that family was of tremendous, that you did the things to respect and honor your parents. My father had very little use for the ritual of the Jewish religion, but he had an intense sense of Judaism. I think he expressed it best in two ways. So I questioned him once for some reason, and he said, the Jews have survived for 2,000 years, and I'm not about to break the chain. And that was a very simple thing to say, but I thought a very meaningful thing. For 2,000 years, Jews had suffered a great deal to retain their Judaism, and out of respect for that effort, my father, and I think I felt the same way, I'm not going to break the chain. We'll continue on. The other thing was an appreciation for what Jews have done in the world. When you consider the number of Jews in proportion to the rest of the world, the number of Jews who have achieved such noteworthy things as Nobel Prizes, as you know, in the arts and science and you name it. Jews have disproportionately excelled in almost every field. Some not so commendable, but he instilled a sense of pride in being Jewish, and I think that is a lot more important than well, I won't. I'll leave it at that. We did the customary things, all of which seemed to me to show a sense of respect. My parents always lit the yahrzeit candles at the anniversary of their parents' death. My mother religiously lit the candles on Friday night. We said the prayer for the bread, the prayer for the wine. I think there's another prayer which I don't know what it is, but no. I mean, and this was a ritual that we went through. The whole thing maybe took 5 minutes, but it was respect for the family tradition that they did this. We went to temple every 4 times a year, twice at Rosh Hashanah and twice at Yom Kippur, and that was the extent of our. But it was the idea that was important. What they thought they were passing on to us as their parents had passed it on to them. His interest in religion was more of an ethical development. We never had discussions about religion. Mind you, I think that was a product of the time more than anything else. Now it's hard to have a discussion at any time without it quickly turning in some way on religion. But in the 20s, in the 20s anyway, I remember when I was in college, a Jewish fraternity, I never remember a discussion of religion at all. It just didn't happen. My father constantly talked about the ethics of doing the right thing, and that's where his religion really centered on. I guess it was the rebellion of Moritz from the Orthodox religion that was passed on, but it still was very largely attributed to Jewishness as much as anything else. Anyhow, I've talked more than enough. I look back on my years with my parents and with my brother and sisters as a wonderful part of my life. We had I think a very enviable period of growing up. I think, can look back with great satisfaction of what we have brought forth from our union with our spouse. Anyway, thank you all. It's been nice all getting together.